Welcome to World Wood Day 2021, Fire in the West. My name is Steve Ambrose, and I'm a retired Forest Service employee who volunteers for the International Wood Culture Society. I volunteer to help bring people together to talk about wood and the culture behind it. I'd like to introduce who we have now on the video. Sarah McCaffrey is a research forester for the Rocky Mountain Research Station. Jeffrey Morisette is the director for the Human Dimension program for the Rocky Mountain Research Station. And we have Jessica Brewen, the Science Delivery and Public Affairs Specialist for the Rocky Mountain Research Station, and Momo Shawl, the video editor and program coordinator for the International Wood Culture Society. In the last few decades, wildfire in the West has become an increasing problem for the United States. It's caused destruction not only for our forests and resources, but for property and lives as well. Although the number of fires has actually decreased, the severity and the acreage has actually increased. International Wood Culture Society is developing some videos to help explain what is happening in the West. If you look at this figure, you can see that the acres burned in 1991 was approximately 2 million, and 2022, the acreage is 10 million. We have invited Jeffrey and Sarah, two research scientists, to talk about how private landowners and homeowners are affected by fire in the West. Thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Steve. I think that as a Forest Service employee, it's great to talk to a society whose motto is wood is good, celebrating the benefit of wood and timber. So appreciate the chance to talk to you about the wildland urban interface and fires in the West and how this is impacting communities. I think sort of wood is good, and in some ways it's important to think that not all fire is bad, but certainly if it's risking your home or your livelihoods or your community, it can be scary and it can be bad. And so what we're trying to do is sort of unpack some of the science behind how fire is impacting and interacting with development and communities. I'm just going to provide a contextual overview of work, a little bit of research, kind of the context of research in the Forest Service, and then talk about the work at the Rocky Mountain Research Station, and then within the Human Dimensions program where Sarah and I both sit. And so here's a graphic showing that the Rocky Mountain Research Station, covering the Rocky Mountain area, is one of 8 research centers across the research and development program within the Forest Service. It's exciting that there is this research component embedded in the land management related to what the Forest Service does. And so we're just one of 8, but the work that we do is kind of shown here across 14 labs and offices in the Rocky Mountain region. We have a handful of science programs. What I like to say about the Human Dimensions program is that the most impactful results that you're going to get from forest and rangeland research are really going to be those that influence human behavior. And so this graphic kind of displays the Human Dimension programs, the topics that we're addressing, and they range from fire, climate, social equity, and there's even some work that we've done related to COVID, especially COVID in fire camps. And then kind of programs that we're working on is shown in the lighter blue across the middle there. And then the foundation of that work is that academic disciplines that are shown on the bottom graphics of those: operations research, economics, quantitative ecology, and where Sarah sits in the social science domain. So I'm going to kind of give a quick overview of some of the work we're doing that brings these things together. We, within the Human Dimensions program, are leading the Forest Service interaction with the Denver Urban Field Station. This is a network of urban field stations across the country. Currently, Denver is the only one that's in the Rocky Mountain region. But that's bringing that climate, social equity together with some of those other disciplines that we're bring to bear on the engagement with communities and how urban communities interact with forest and the Forest Service. So there's also work in the Human Dimensions program that's looking at fire and COVID and climate being impacts of increasing the fire, as Steve mentioned. And some of this work was looking at how incident commands and folks on an incident are interacting with each other, and how that interaction comes into play with respect to where they've come from and where they'll go after they're serving at that incident. And that was published recently. Another piece of work that's being done in the program is Fuelcast, and that's looking at rangelands primarily and how fuels are building up to serve as feed for the ranching community as well as a fuel for bringing in kind of the typical vegetation as well as where invasives are coming in and increasing that fire challenge in those rangeland areas. The wildfire research team, or what's called WIRE, is really working at kind of that community grassroots level to better understand, how these complex decisions are playing out with respect to homeowners and communities and how they're hearing the message of how to keep their homes more safe and how effective their reaction to that message is or their attention to that message and how we can better work with them to get the clear messages across and get the communities more resilient to fires. So the Co-Management of Fire Risk Transmission Partnership is working with multiple jurisdictions, often in the WUI or in kind of where you have that interface with residential areas. There's multiple jurisdictions ranging from the homeowners, the municipalities, other private landowners, and then state forest or county lands and federal lands. And so it's a complex risk that needs to be kind of considered across those jurisdictions, and how you better build resilience to those communities is best built by involving the various partners in those areas. Work that's more on the quantitative ecology and operations research side is assisting with pre-fire planning and as well as active fire management with these potential operational delineations. And what this does is sort of defines lines on the landscape where you might have the best ability to fire, and then if you do have the ability to control the fire, and that might be at a road line or a water body or a low vegetation, high altitude tundra across the peak, so where is it that the fire has the best chance of being controlled, and then how challenging it would be to get into that area to do control efforts, and that kind of defines these polygons. And then within each polygon, understanding what values are at risk, and those can be the residential communities or other resources such as endangered species habitat or infrastructure relative to water supplies. It's combining that understanding of where a fire might be contained with then within that container the risks that would be present there, and then prioritizing which areas you want to do the most with to protect as much as possible those values at risk. So now kind of turning a little bit more to Sarah's work is kind of social science in general, how it can improve wildfire outcomes, and it's collaborative with key partners. And Sarah is going to go into more detail about kind of how her work has considered the wildland-urban interface. I thought it would be useful for the presentation today to kind of lay out the definitions of the wildland-urban interface. This is from Volko Radiloff's paper in 2005, which was kind of seminal in defining the WUI, and it's where houses are in or near the wildland vegetation in an area where wildfires pose the greatest risk to people due to the proximity of flammable vegetation. What's interesting, though, is when you get into the definitions that Sarah will describe, there's some nuances with respect to the quantitative methods that are used to define that and how that interacts with fires. So we'll be kind of covering this intermix, which is kind of a threshold of the housings per kilometer, and the vegetation around that, and an interface as defined here. And maybe with that, I can hand it over to Sarah to sort of go into some more details about this idea of the WUI, the definitions of WUI, and how it's playing out with fires, especially over the last 20 or 30 years.
So thanks, Jeff. That was an excellent introduction to the WUI. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what exactly is the WUI, and Wildland Urban Interface, classic name, but everyone pretty much says WUI. So what is it? And I encourage you to look at this photo and think about where that might be taken. And it's not necessarily where you think it is. So this is the map that has come out of that Radiloff work that, that Jeff referenced the definition on. That definition is based from a US Congress document that the Silvis Lab and University of Madison used to develop this map in conjunction with the Forest Service with the Northern Research Station. So this sort of gives you the map. And a couple things to notice in this map when we think about the wildland urban interface and the fire problem. The first is we often think about it as the wildland urban interface fire problem in the West, but it's useful to notice that the vast majority of the interface or the WUI is actually in the East Coast. And so then you might say, well, what's up with that? Is that because there's no fire out there? And no, there's actually fire. This is actually from 2017 of fire starts from across the country for the whole year. Now, these are from a satellite, so they're fire starts. So they include both wildland fire, prescribed burns, and agricultural burning. So you can't distinguish, except for you can kind of guess that most of the ones in the Midwest are agricultural burning. But as you can see from here, it's common across the United States. And in the Southeast, where the WUI is also the most prominent place, there are a lot of fires. A lot of that would be prescribed burning, but some of that would be other types of fires. And then it migrates across the country as the year goes along, moving up into the Midwest in May, and then over to the West in summer and fall. And you can also see a really good example of agricultural burning by the November-December blue line in California, which is all the Central Valley, and that's all their agricultural burning there. But it sort of shows that, like, trying to sort of simplify WUI, fire risk, they're not inherently the same thing. And that's the other key point to think about, which is that there is no part of the wildland interface definition that has anything to do with fire. It is just a definition about housing density and percentage of vegetation cover. So it is used by many people, including ecologists, for landscape fragmentation and a lot of other reasons other than fire. So it's important to recognize that it's not the same thing. The WUI does not equal fire risk. So that's the other point, is we often hear it's growing. Oh, it's growing vastly. And I think it's useful to think through what that actually means. So here's the wildland urban interface in 1990, and here it is in 2010. And I'll just go back. Hopefully this goes back quickly, but you can sort of see most of the growth is actually mostly in the Southeast. And in the West, it's actually, if you look at the West, there's actually not all that much wildland urban interface in the West, relatively speaking. But to get a better picture, I'm going to drill down and look at Colorado. So here's Colorado in 1990. And here's Colorado in 2010. And worth noticing, the orange is the intermix. And so I often think we should really be calling it the wildland urban intermix, or residential wildland intermix, because that sort of is a better description of what we're actually talking about, not urban. And then I'm going to drill down even more to around Denver to make a couple points to think about when we talk about the growth in the wildland urban interface, and sort of contextualize what that means, because it's often this very simplistic statement of like, oh, it's growing. Oh, that's the problem. So this is Denver in 1990. And here's Denver in 2010. And I'm going to highlight sort of two places down here on the outskirts of Denver, where in 2010 you have a really big interface. So that's kind of worth looking at, because there's 1990, and there you have it. Now, that area is actually southeast of Denver. It is rolling grasslands with a few maybe woodlands. It is not what we would consider, it has a fire risk, absolutely, but it is not what we would consider high fire risk. So again, we have to think about where exactly is this growth happening. It's not automatic that that growth is increasing our fire risk. It's also worth noticing that most of the really where we think of as the severe risk is on the Front Range, which is sort of along here. And when you look at that, from 1990, there's growth, but it's not going everywhere. And it's also not surprising to notice that most of that growth is happening on private lands. And then to look at a slightly different location, these two locations, because they sort of point out a slightly different part of this dynamic. So in the top bubble, what you'll see when you look at 2010 is actually the land ownership has changed. And I don't actually know what the story is there, whether it's a trade between the Forest Service and private lands, but it's just to say that some of these factors, are not as static as we think they are. And the other one is in that bottom bubble. If you look down, what you see is actually a complete infill in one of the little spaces. Now, as far as I can figure out, that's probably the Winter Park ski area, where they have had a fair amount of growth in Fraser. But again, that's a specific community where the growth is happening. So it's not everywhere that we're having this growth. It's specific locations, and it's locations where you have some sort of recreation thing. So this is all just kind of meant to sort of say, there's a lot more context and nuance to this notion of the wildland urban interface is contributing to the fire risk. It's also important to say where and how is it contributing to the fire risk, because it's not an automatic that it is. It's not an automatic that it's not, but we need to actually be careful about thinking about exactly when and how it is. And then as people get involved in talking about these issues, I think it's useful to, particularly for this group who's beginning to think about the topic, to recognize that there's a lot of terminology that we use when we talk about these issues. It's often used, it's often conflated and used interchangeably, but it's not. And that's not a minor thing, because it kind of shapes how we end up having the discussion. So one of the things that, I've sort of been getting at with this sort of like, the map is of the WUI, that's not the fire risk. And there's a difference between hazard, which is sort of the conditions that create potential for bad outcomes. And risk is actually about the probability of the actual event happening. So they're not the same thing. And so if you're measuring hazard, you are not measuring risk. And it's important to distinguish between those two. And then there's a whole bunch of terms: preparedness, prevention, mitigation, suppression. And it's kind of striking how even within the fire community, these are often used interchangeably, and they're really kind of very distinct terms. So mitigation is about actions you take to reduce the potential damage if you have an event. And prevention is about preventing the event. So preventing a fire from starting is prevention, that is not mitigation. And we often refer to fuels treatment as prevention, and it's not. You're not stopping the fire from happening, but you are mitigating the potential impacts if it happens. And suppression is about putting the fire out. So they're all kind of different, and it matters that we use these terms correctly, because otherwise we're sort of talking at cross purposes. And that's kind of an odd way to end my discussion about the WUI, but I think it's an important way to think about as we continue the rest of our discussion.
Thank you both for a very interesting presentation. Can we open it up now to questions? I've got a few. Momo, you have a few
Yes.
questions too. Would you like to start out?
Yes, please. So for the two of you, what is the biggest challenge for this research so far? Because I think there are so many elements, and these elements changes from time to time, developed by years. So what is the biggest challenge for you guys then?
I think a challenge for the management community is balancing the various risks and various trade-offs. When you do a prescribed fire, you're maybe minimizing that risk, but you're impacting air quality, and you're coming up against regulations relative to the air quality. If you want to protect one area, are you putting resources? You're taking them away from another area. So the balance and trade-offs between how fire management is done is certainly complex. I think where a challenge is 100 years of a culture of fighting fires that has not always recognized the social science, the human dimensions component of bringing in the voices across those communities. And so some of the projects I mentioned, the Wiry and that Comfort project, as well as Sarah's work, is really trying to better understand the social dimension. And I like to say it's kind of the softer sciences that's kind of harder to do. It's maybe easier to use remote sensing and do a quantitative map that you can turn the crank and reproduce, but who are the people that live within that map? What's the culture that's been going on there for years, either indigenous or ranching communities or new people to that area? They're all bringing a different, unique perspective, and that's not something you're going to easily quantify with data layers coming from a GIS, but rather you have to dig into that understanding, and that's the place-based work is challenging to scale up and do that nationally against that culture that's in the Forest Service. Because I think we are, with some of our programs, starting to make some progress, starting to think about it the right way, engaging with others in the social science and the quantitative, the hard sciences. But there's work to do, and with Sarah's challenges and opportunities, maybe that points to some other opportunities that we have.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Jeff touched on sort of what I think is one of the biggest challenges, which is that there's kind of a natural human tendency, and the natural hazards research has shown for a long time that when we deal with a hazard, the first societal tendency is let's fix it with an engineering fix or a technological fix, because those are, they're easier, that we can control them. It's, we can fly planes and suppress fires. And that is where we tend to focus our attention and our research. And it's really important research to get a basis for a lot of tools. But then we tend to treat the social as if it's kind of straightforward, which is really ironic because it's the least straightforward of all of the dynamics. But I think that makes it less appealing to a lot of people because they have no control over it. So we default to a lot of narratives about what the social issue is. So, Jeff got my attention with the sort of the new people, and that's a common narrative. It's all these new people who are moving into the wildland urban interface, and they don't understand fire and they're not proactive. And actually the research is really clear that there is no consistent evidence that new people are less likely to understand the fire risk. And part of that's that 60% of moves are within a county. So most of those people are just moving from a different neighborhood. And nor is there evidence that the new people are less likely to be proactive. In fact, there's some evidence that they're more proactive than people who've lived in a place for a long time. But it's a very handy narrative to tell that creates a simple, and it makes intuitive sense. And so I think the big challenge with social science is that a lot of what we see with the public, they can't speak back, right? And they can't argue when we can make a conclusion about what the public thinks. And so that's why social science is really important, because we actually give the public a voice and enable them to sort of say, hey, no, actually, we're doing a lot of work on our land. And we understand the fire risk and we're doing stuff about it. So that's, I think, the real challenge, is just sort of breaking down those sort of set narratives that kind of are very appealing for a lot of reasons.
Thank you.
I've got a question, and it kind of goes back to what you were saying, Sarah, but what responsibilities do you think that the landowners and the homeowners have on their private lands, and what can the different agencies within the government, both the state, the federal, and maybe the local, do to try to increase their view of what fire is and how it may affect them? Are there things that they can do to really help out these landowners?
Yeah, and that's actually one where I can speak directly from the research, which is very clear that when you talk to landowners, the basic response is every landowner is responsible for mitigating the fire risk on their land. I chose to live here. It's my job to mitigate my risk, but you, as a federal landowner, you need to mitigate fire risk on your property. So there's a very strong sense of shared responsibility amongst landowners in terms of, no, I chose to live here. I should mitigate the risk. The challenge was sort of helping people mitigate their risk from outside. And they do want, when you ask them, what do you expect of government agencies? They will say, well, I would like information, but it's not generic. It's like specific to my piece of property. What do I need to be doing? And, for the fire risk, specific to my piece of property, where's the fire likely to come from? That kind of stuff. They would like, maybe we want you to take care of your land. I'll take care of mine, you take care of yours. And in some places, they sort of say it would be helpful to have some assistance with the bigger things, like getting rid of vegetation. Communities, when you have a lot of elderly people, maybe we could use help from young people to help us do the work on our property that we physically can't anymore. So that's kind of what I hear them say that they want help from agencies from. And the other point I think I would make is that when we talk about helping people get the risk, they understand the risk. I've met very few people who look at you like fire risk. They sort of are like, no, look around you. Of course, fire is a problem here. The issue is that people have complicated lives, and fire is just one thing in their lives that they have to worry about, that they have to take care of, and that they have to fit into all the many concerns that they're working on. And so it's not about getting them to understand the fire risk. It's about figuring out how we can help them make it easier to fit it into their everyday lives. And in most cases, once people start mitigating, it becomes part of their daily property maintenance. And so it's not about getting them to do anything, but about figuring out how can we help them make it an easier part of all these other things that they're juggling and trying to deal with.
Just one quick follow-up question. People that have had a fire event on their property and they have actually lost their homes, do people tend to want to come back and rebuild, or do they say, that's enough, I'm done?
That's a very complicated dynamic, and it's very personal, and it's been shown with other hazards too. There are a lot of people are like, no, I live here. I'm here for a reason. I love this place, or it's where my job is. And so place attachment is actually a really important factor that we need to take into account. But there will also be people who are like, nope, not. And I think some of this has to do with what's called risk attitudes, which is how comfortable we are with risk. And so people who are really risk tolerant are like, yeah, that was not fun, but I love this place and I am not moving. And people who are really risk averse are probably saying, I don't want to be reminded about that, and I'm going to move someplace else. But I was actually talking with a researcher a couple of days ago who's looking at paradise and asking people this question. And she said she found people who are moving elsewhere because they like, I don't want to be reminded, but she also found that they're not moving to places that don't have fire as a risk.
And explain what Paradise is and what happened there, if you would, for our viewers.
Yeah. So Paradise is a community in California that in 2018 had a fire start out outside of it in extreme conditions and burnt into the town very quickly, and basically burned down 20,000 homes, I think, or 20,000 structures. Not the entire town, but the vast majority of it. And so a very significant event for that in the United States in general. But so she's talking to people there to find out, are you rebuilding? Because most of the community has to rebuild if they stay there. And it has found that, some are rebuilding, absolutely. But the ones who moved, she actually has followed them a little bit to see where they moved to and why they moved to where they did. And they didn't choose to move to some place because it was a lower fire risk. In fact, one person moved to a place that then had another fire. But they're moving to places they can afford to live, basically.
It sounds like there's some similarities to hurricane.
Yeah, no, there's tons. There's a lot that is parallel from in the fire, what we're finding in fire. And my basis of research is on the natural hazards field. And so I draw a lot from the natural hazards and what we know from other hazards. And the parallels are very consistent across hazards, except the specificity of like the dynamics of a certain hazard and how quickly the onset is and how much warning you have and that kind of thing. So yeah, very parallel.
So sometimes I see, on the news, you see some houses they sustained, but some they got destroyed. But and I thought, and always hear, some people say, oh, these are the miracle houses that sustained. And yeah, so I was just wondering if there's just pure luck, or there's actually some things that people can do to actually protect their homes.
There are a lot of things that people can do to protect their property. And that's what I mean when people say, it's my job to mitigate risk on my property. What they're talking about are two different things that you can do that make a huge difference. One is managing the vegetation around your home, particularly within about 100 feet or 100 yards of the structure. And that's not removing it all. It's just disrupting the vegetation so that it doesn't carry fire, and removing the vegetation that's like within 3 or 5 feet of the house is really critical. So that's to stop partly the fire, carrying the fire to the house, but the really critical thing is to eliminate the ember sources, because that's actually how most houses are catch on fire. It's not from the flame front, it's actually from embers. And so those embers get into the attic through vents in the eaves, or they sit and smolder in a pile of leaves that are at the corner of a house or under a deck. And that's actually what catches the house on fire. So one thing you're trying to do is disrupt the carrying of fire and embers to your house by managing your vegetation. And the other action that makes a huge difference is making your home more ignition resistant. So the single thing you can do that makes a difference is having a fire resistant roof. And that can be a metal roof or a Class A roof. And that is actually the single thing you can do that's going to decrease the chance your house actually burns down. But there's other things such as putting little screens over your vents in your roof or your soffits so that the embers don't get in and get into your attic. If you have a deck, it's closing the deck in underneath so the embers don't go and hang out in whatever is sitting underneath your deck. So there's a lot of actions that you can take to make your home really fire ignition resistant. And when you've done that, and your vegetation, it really improves the potential that your house will survive a fire, whether or not it has somebody there, a firefighter there to protect it. So there's a lot homeowners can do. Often your fire department will have that information. There's also the FireWise program, Fire Adapted Communities USA, and the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety has really great brochures that are specific to different regions in the US that give you ideas about what you can do.
What can communities do to help the fire situation? We've talked about individuals and structures. What about communities themselves? What can they do?
Well, then at least with me, you run into the lovely social science question of, well, that depends how you define community. But when you have a community that is like a neighborhood, you can actually develop neighborhood groups that work together and develop a sort of sense of community responsibility, and you're helping your neighbors out. It is one of the challenges is we often default to programs that assume that that's the program that you need, a program that sort of gets the community and all the neighbors working together. But a lot of places where you have fire risk, people have moved there expressly not to talk to their neighbors. So focusing too much on that's the only way we can have a community program, that doesn't mean that the neighbors aren't talking to each other. They will absolutely have a network for that's like emergency response kind of network, but that doesn't mean that they want to have like work group parties or things where they're all working together. So a lot of it is about tailoring a program that's appropriate for your community and what your community needs. And what's actually going to work with the particular culture of that community. So I can't really say, here's exactly what communities need to do, but I've seen programs across the country that are really varied. And the ones that work really well are ones that are really tailored to the specific needs of their community.
So Sarah, you had mentioned landscape fragmentation, and I know that can mean a lot of different things depending on the kind of research that's being done, whether it's wildlife or could you define what landscape fragmentation is as far as social sciences or human dimensions is concerned?
That's a very interesting question. I don't think we really talk about landscape fragmentation from a social science point of view. I guess where it would become really relevant is in terms of land management and the challenges that are created by having multiple landowners and the need to work across boundaries and coordinate work. And so in that sense, landscape fragmentation comes into play in terms of social science in a lot of the work that's being done about working across land ownerships. We don't really think about it or talk about it as in relation to landscape fragmentation. So that's kind of an interesting way that you framed it. But it is a definite question. But some of the questions about working across boundaries is actually across very large ownerships. So that may be part of why it doesn't come up, because the landscape fragmentation as a concern is more around when you break it up into small parcels, and that disrupts, animal migration patterns or can facilitate insect movement or the insects that you don't like, invasive species movements. So that's kind of where it comes into play and why it's probably a more common way of framing the problem in ecological thinking than it is in social science thinking, but I'm going to think more about that.
That kind of brings me into my next question of, obviously research is always evolving, and I'm sure that, a lot of research is done thinking about the 10 years from now, the 20 years from now, and so on. So I guess, how do you see, and this may be for both of you, how do you see human dimensions or the social science research evolving into the future? Like, is the West going to keep on getting bigger? Are those boundaries going to keep on expanding with climate change? And is that research, area going, do you predict that it's going to keep growing? And where is your research kind of predicting that how the future is going to go as far as social sciences human dimension research?
It's a great question. And I think some of the research we're doing is a function of the growing complexity and a realization of that complexity and understanding that as climate change and a century of fire suppression has created bigger and more dramatic fires, we've got to rethink kind of how we solve a problem. It's a different problem. And so when the problem changes and you've got a culture that is used to doing it a certain way, I think there's a lot of energy and excitement and opportunities, and this is across the Forest Service and across land management agencies, to recognize that things are changing and we need to do things. We need to find different ways to address the problem that's changing. And so I think it's the necessity being the mother of invention here. It's not that social science hasn't been around. I think now there's just a recognition of the complexity of the problem and appreciation that social science, as well as operations research and some of those other disciplines I mentioned in the Human Dimensions program, coupled with that quantitative analysis that's critical as well, be all sort of brought into the mix to really develop more strategic solutions, because the resources tend to be finite. You only have so many firefighters, you only have so many aircraft to help with the fire and spread retardant. So, how do we address a growing and complex problem? I think that means we need to come up with new solutions. I think new solutions means we need to look across the disciplines and do an truly interdisciplinary approach to try to develop those solutions. So I think, in a 20-year time frame, in human dimensions is pretty general, right? But those disciplines that I was mentioning, the operations research, social science, economics, are all going to provide insight, and to the extent that we can kind of demonstrate that insight and the benefit of that insight, the more it's going to be incorporated into the culture and the solutions that we're working towards.
Yeah, and I would second everything that Jeff said, but I think 10 or 20 years down the road, social science will not necessarily be my hope would be that it would be way more common, because it's really fundamentally critical to coming up with new solutions. As I like to tell fire managers when I talk to them, when we talk about fire, we're talking about understanding a biophysical process. When we're talking about understanding fire management, the moment you talk about management, you're fundamentally talking about a social process. So unless you are actually putting the work into understanding the social process at the same degree and nuance as we are in terms of understanding the biophysical process, the odds that we're going to come up with useful solutions decrease. And we really need to have a strong base of social science as the foundation for what we're going to do with all that biophysical science that we are also developing. And the other thing about, I think, the value of that interdisciplinarity that Jeff was referencing is bringing in alternative ways of thinking. So we often think about fire just from the fire perspective, but there's amazing stuff happening in communities already. I know communities that are like already 15 years ahead of where the narrative says we are in terms of adapting to fire. And when you bring in people from other fields, Steve mentioned natural hazards and other hazards. We can learn from those. There's other places where we can learn other things. It's again, that sort of idea of, if we want to come up with solutions, we have to figure out how to fit them in along with everything else society is contending with. So saying that the wildland urban interface is the challenge, and if we just didn't have the homes in those areas, that would solve the problem. Well, in California, that's where people can afford to live. What hazard are you going to have people move to? So it's that kind of more holistic point of view that I think is where social science has a lot of value to add in bringing in all these different perspectives into the discussion. And I think that's where social science really has the value down the road.
I think, according to what I just have heard, I think I got a really different impression from what I have read before, because before talking to you guys, when I read about the Wui fire, it always feels like we need to control, how to eliminate the interfering between human behavior and the wildland. But it sounds like it's a totally different thing. It sounds like the biggest problem for fires are mostly about how people interact with the natural land. So is it correct for me to say that, it's more about teaching people how to behave correctly when they are living in this weed zone? Should we train our mind to do better, to live in an area like this, to reduce the risk? Is that correct to say it that way?
It's getting there. I'm never very comfortable when we say teach people how to live correctly, because what is correct to one person is not correct to another, and who gets to decide what is and isn't correct? That's a very social science kind of answer, which is, there's a diversity of values out there.
What you do.
What's that for me? Yeah, exactly. But there's a diversity of values out there, and to presume that there's one value that is the right value is part of where we've created the problem. So Jeff talked about, we've been managing for 100 years, and that was based on this system of control that you're talking about that was formed in the early 1900s, when that was kind of the common conception that man could control nature, and we could control these natural elements, and we could control fire. And I think what we've been learning over time is that actually can be really counterproductive, and that can create as many problems as you think you're solving. And then the key is to learn how to live with this. And the good news is that humans, I think people have called us, we're a pyrophytic species. We evolved with fire. Fire has been integral to human evolution. So we have known how to live with fire for a long time. And I think it's not about that. It's just about relearning what actually works, and relearning what's going to work in an ecosystem and an environment that's likely going to look somewhat different from what we're used to.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. That's an excellent reply, and it's a great question, Momo. And I think that on a national level, in a strategic framework, there's the cohesive strategy, and it'd be great for your community to maybe be familiar with it or to understand that. And resilient landscapes is one of the three major themes of that, and fire-adapted communities is the second, safe and effective wildland fire response is the third. So, I think and this has sort of come online in the last 10 years, and it seems to have some pretty strong foundation that persists in how we're managing fires across federal and state agencies. And so I think what Sarah was saying and the question leads to this idea that it's living with fire and not trying to separate where we live from where there's fire. I think there's a general understanding that we need to be kind of more resilient to it. And like I was saying kind of at the beginning of the talk, like wood is good and maybe not all fire is bad. And so trying to adapt a little bit towards that. And I think it goes to Jessica's question is that, and Sarah's reply of how important it is to understand values, communities, the human dimensions to building fire adapted communities and being resilient to fire. So I think there's a lot that social science and some of the work in human dimensions can complement the living into the national cohesive strategy.
Yeah, and a phrase that I and a couple of my colleagues I work with like to have is that it's not just the notion that we can live with fire, but that we can actually thrive with fire.
Could we also try to, reduce the risk from controlling the woods? Like, for example, like there are species that's more dangerous for wildfires, or like could we actually do something like that?
I would argue that is actually what I'd say a huge portion of the Forest Service is busy doing. It's not about one species is better or worse than another. There are species out there that have evolved with fire. They live very well with fire. It's about allowing fire to play its natural role in those systems so that those systems are healthy and resilient. And with fire suppression, what's happened is we've removed that key process from those systems, and they're not really healthy or resilient anymore. So it's not that one tree species is going to be better than another inherently. They're natural to the systems they're in. And it's about allowing those natural systems to function as they normally would.
It's important to add that, you're hearing from Sarah and I in the Human Dimensions program at one research station. You could probably have hours and hours of conversations across the Forest Service. There's a lot of been with the Forest Service for a year now, and appreciating the passion and dedication across the Forest Service to this issue. And there is that quantitative analysis and the management practices and the incident commands and the work that's done. So there's a tremendous amount of work across the Forest Service, as well as other land management agencies, that are addressing the problem. But we're coming from it at the unique perspective of the social science at the Rocky Mountain Research Station and what we're bringing to it. And I think it's an important part, but it is certainly one part of a vast array of research and applied efforts to help deal with the wildfire issue. A problem in some areas and opportunity in others.
As a science delivery specialist, I work closely with research and development out of the Washington office, and I also work with all the research stations across the country. And this is not limited to the West. And there is a ton of collaboration nationwide and also internationally that, our researchers are reaching around the world, covering literally almost every aspect of fire. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. Such important work, and thank you for sharing and joining. And I encourage people to check out what we do on our site and contact Sarah and Jeff for more questions and more inquiries about their research and their expertise.
I appreciate the chance to talk to you all. I'm hoping that the International Wood Culture Society found this interesting and useful, and maybe this is opening the door for further dialogue, staying in touch with you and your society of how this social science and the human dimensions work that we're doing might interface with your community and the work that you're doing.
Yeah, I would just repeat what Jeff said, that thank you for this opportunity. It's always good to have more interest in what we're working in and new views being brought to the table, because I think that that's how we're really going to ultimately solve the problem, is by bringing in a lot of different perspectives who have perhaps new and better ideas about how we might have better outcomes down the road.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank all of you for your participation in this very interesting event.
I really think this is a good opportunity for more people to get a basic understanding of how wildfire happens, how we can get along with them. Like what you guys just said, it's not about how to prevent them, it's more about how we live with them. And I think it's really important to let more people know about this. So yeah,
yes,
I really appreciate it. Thank you all.
Again, thank you very much for your participation in this. And the International Wood Culture Society hopes to prepare more videos along the line of fire in the West and how we got to where we are today, and perhaps what can we do to alleviate the situation.
Okay,
great.
sounds good.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot.